Hello, and welcome to this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. On this podcast, we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with some of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. I'm your host, Professor Betsy Hayes, in the Media, Communications, and Journalism Department at Fresno State. Enjoy! Today, we are so happy to have in the studio John Zelezny, and John happens to have, we were just discussing the length of our friendship, which we did decide was 35 years. I met John when I was a student at Fresno State. That's back when it was the journalism department. He was our professor and department chair. And so it's been really fun for me to, observe and participate in his wonderful career, which has many facets and some twists and turns. And I can't wait for you all to hear more about him. So welcome, John.
Well, gee, thanks. It's great to be part of this project. It's an exciting project.
Thank you. I know our listeners are really going to benefit from hearing all of the stories. So to provide our listeners with some context, let's start talking about your career path. How did it all begin?
Well, the honest answer to that probably goes all the way back to high school, because writing classes, English classes seemed to come easy for me. So I slid right into a journalism major with a public relations emphasis up at Humboldt State. And that's really what launched everything. I was fortunate there to work on the student newspaper and on another newspaper in the area. And I slid right into a newspaper job after that, and then a public relations job. And I took time away from that to go to law school. And after law school, then it was basically running 100 miles an hour. A lot of things happened after that.
I love it. And the law school piece is going to be a fun part of our conversation because there are going to be textbooks involved and all kinds of things that were directly and indirectly related to that piece. So after law school, how did you transition into the world of professor?
I had some tough calls to make because I got the top grade in the class in contract law. And before I even graduated, I had a job offer without even an interview to work for a firm down in Santa Barbara doing contracts. But I also had an offer to teach at Northern Arizona State and specialize in media law. And that gave me the opportunity then to also approach a publisher and start working on a textbook project, which was a career goal back even before I went to law school. And I ended up doing 6 editions of that. It was a huge project. It got me investigating a lot of different areas of communication-related law. And so these pieces just fit together. But it is true, I was running pretty hard. I was teaching a full load at Fresno State while I was completing the textbook. And so the textbook was written at midnight.
Yes, and it was a textbook that we used in our department for several decades, and many, many universities used it for their communication law course throughout.
It became the top seller in the field, which I was proud of, because I think it was written in terms that an undergraduate student could grasp without a bunch of Latin phrases and unnecessary footnotes, though it still had its share.
Those darn footnotes, right? Necessary evil, but yes. So after Northern Arizona State, and you were here at Fresno State, you also spent a little time as department chair and leading the charge and teaching all of the PR classes. And so let's talk a little bit about teaching. What did you enjoy? What was fulfilling about teaching students about public relations and communication law?
Well, I always regarded it as an exploration for the students and the professor. So in those fields I was teaching, there was always something new going on in current events or some big case at the Supreme Court. Always something that changed from semester to semester and something else to investigate. So if we regarded it as an investigation, an exploration together, I think that created the right chemistry in the classroom. And semester to semester, it wasn't just me reading the same notes again. There was always some new thing to investigate and engage students with. And that's what I enjoyed the most. I tended to have big classes and full loads, and in the time I was here at Fresno State, altogether I had about 3,000 students. That's a lot.
Definitely a lot.
As you can imagine, the thing I probably liked the least was the grading aspect, which was onerous.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's a lot of term papers, a lot of essay exams.
And I really appreciate you mentioning the fact that there is always something new. And I think that is one of the most interesting things about both practicing and teaching in this profession is there is always an evolution and always something that is dynamic and revolutionary. And those words sound a little bit like hyperbole, but I don't believe they are. Is that something that continued to keep you interested in this world?
Yes. I ended up doing, as I mentioned, 6 editions of that textbook plus a companion casebook. And then while that was going on, if that weren't enough to keep me engaged in developments, the State Bar of California also hired me for almost a decade every year to write all of the problem materials for their big statewide moot court competition that all the law schools participate in. And it's a really big deal. So those materials have to be done just right. And there can't be an obvious winning side. You have to present a problem that has no obvious solution. So to your point, yeah, that causes a person to be engaged at the deepest level.
So after teaching for a while at Fresno State, you got an interesting transition opportunity here at the university. Talk about that a little bit. How did that happen and where did you end up?
Well, the university was going through some transition at the time in a number of ways. Most importantly, there was a new president, and there was a push to do some things differently or at a higher level, including things like fundraising. And the basketball program hired a very high-profile coach, Coach Tarkanian, which brought a lot of extra media scrutiny. And so there were multiple challenges going on at that time, and I offered some suggestions to the administration when times were getting tough. And that led to the university, I think, deciding to create a different kind of university relations position, something at the vice president level. And they encouraged me to apply for it, and I ended up going that direction, moving into administration and away from teaching for a few years.
And how was that experience? Can you share something from that time period that you're proud of or was especially interesting? Because I'm sure there was a lot packed into those few years.
There was an awful lot packed into those few years. I felt like I was running 100 different directions at once sometimes, and playing defense too often, which is not really what a good PR executive wants to be doing. You want to control your message and your communication avenues better. But it was hard to do that with the apparatus we had to work with at the time. And so I think what marked that tenure for me was just there were fires to put out all the time. And probably the worst one was when 60 Minutes called, the CBS folks. They heard that things were maybe not exactly smooth with the basketball program here, and the coach was such a high-profile figure that they wanted to do a whole segment on just the Fresno State basketball team. But that was a stressful period. They don't just come for a couple days and leave. It was about a 4-month ordeal. And so there would be requests. They wanted records, and then they wanted places to shoot, and we would have to make special arrangements. I remember even in the administration building at the time, they were conducting an interview there, and they didn't like that they could hear the heat coming through the vents. They said our microphones are too sensitive, and they asked us to shut off the heat, this is in February, in the whole building so they could do their interview. It was just one thing after another. And so it was an interesting period, but I was willing to do battle with some of the folks trying to attack us. And I think the senior administration appreciated that.
Without a doubt. And your work also caught the attention of one of our largest employers in town, and you ended up transitioning to Community Medical Center. So talk about that path, and particularly since you were there for as long as you were, how you evolved the function there, because you really transformed their communications function.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think there were a few things that probably caught the attention of the hospital system. One was that I was authoring some op-ed pieces at the time that they thought were well done. And I was willing to go toe-to-toe with Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes. And we had some very quick responses to their segment because we knew what the segment was going to be in advance, and I had everything written and ready to go on fax machines all over campus. So I think the hospital system noted that our PR had become more aggressive at the university. And the hospital system was having its own growing pains at the time. There were projects that the local media weren't totally convinced about that were very expensive. And so I was invited to come in and speak to the board of trustees at one point about their plans for a rebranding and how they would organize their unit internally to move things along as best as possible. So I did that. And then shortly thereafter, the CEO invited me back again to talk just with him about specifics of organizing a good communications unit internally. And I sketched it out for him on a sheet of paper. Then, similar to the Fresno State thing, they decided to create a whole new senior vice president position for public relations, and they just offered it to me. And so that's how that happened. I guess in both of those cases, what the interesting thing is, I provided a little free advice first, and then the opportunity opened up after that. And then as to the unit, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
And I'm happy to dive into that. But the short of it is this. If you look up and down the valley, most communications units are designed to do what I would call simple output. So they produce T-shirts with logos on them, and if they get a call from the media, they'll provide a quick answer and put out some news releases, and they don't really go a whole lot further than that. So when I got to the community health system, that's a lot of what I saw going on. And they had a good staff there with a much bigger budget than I had at the university. But when they had team meetings, they would go down a list that was 3 or 4 pages long of projects. And each person would report on where that stood. So if someone asked for pencils with logos on them, that would be given a project number, and somebody would report on the status of that. And this, I think, really goes to the heart of your interesting project here, Betsy, is that kind of unit is just not going to be competitive in a bigger market or a situation where things need to go up another level. So what I needed to do was transform that to a unit that's focused on the business priorities of the employer and that has its eye every single day on whether its efforts are having impact. So I'm not interested in how many pencils go out with logos on them. I really couldn't care less. So we just stopped with all that. And then I went to HR and I said, look, I need to redesign this whole unit. New job titles, new responsibilities. And so again, I sketched it out on paper the way it was and then the way I wanted it. And the vice president for HR said, well, she said, that's a lot of change. So this is going to take us a couple days. And I said, a couple days, perfect. So every title changed and the unit was reorganized to focus on business priorities for the healthcare system. And that's a big change. And at the time, I didn't look around the valley and see many units operating that way. But if there were projects that I couldn't identify the impact from, I just stopped them because you only have so much labor and it needs to focus somewhere else.
And the staff, I'm sure that was both a welcome and challenging transition for them, I'm assuming, because it was probably not a hard sell philosophically, but I'm assuming that there was probably a little bit of an adjustment period, right? Because they were used to doing the 4-page project list with the logos of the pencils, and now, their focus is completely different. So that, I'm sure, took some shepherding.
So I think you're right on target with that. That's exactly how it was. It wasn't a hard sell in the sense that I was asking for something more exciting, actually, more impactful, more important. And they got that in a hurry. Yeah. But it's still change. And you know how that goes.
Yeah, what's that book? Who Moved My Cheese, right? You just took the cheese and, I don't know, made a bunch of souffles and yeah. I love it.
But I think I'm really proud of the staff, the way it developed there, and many of the projects that we did go forward with. And fundraising increased, and community went ahead with some humongous projects costing tens and tens of millions of dollars, but which now are hugely important to the healthcare of this region. And we did a lot of public education to help those things get launched as best as possible and utilized properly. So those were important things. We didn't want people showing up at the wrong emergency room, for example. I mean, these are big, important things, much more so than logos on pencils.
So one of the other things that you started while you were there was the television program, was MedWatch, which again was revolutionary and a much different tactic than a PR office for a large organization was doing. So can you talk a little bit about why you thought that was important and how that all went?
I felt that the healthcare system, by far the biggest in the region, needed to have its own medium that had pretty far reach. So we looked at alternatives. And this is going back a while, so the magazine industry hadn't totally collapsed yet by then. And that was one of the other things we were looking at. But the tough thing there is distribution, the postage. If you really want to get it out, it adds up. And when we investigated doing a local TV show where we would partner with one of the stations here, it seemed like something that was economically more sensible and played to the strengths of our staff at the time, because I had a number of PR and TV experienced folks. That's a good combination. And so they were able to really design this show, and it's had a long run.
Yeah. When did it start? What was the year?
And the fun thing, too, was just shortly after we launched it, it wasn't just like some advertorial. It was a very informative show, and it was pulling a rating. So it's not like running an ad. I can't even remember now how many years it's been, but I still see segments playing all over the place.
Absolutely. And did the format change at all during that time, or did the structure that you created initially stay pretty much intact?
I think pretty much intact, but with some adjustments as we went along. Yeah, it follows a pretty typical format in many respects, where there are segments within the half hour, and you have a host. And so the audience knows what's coming, and it was great because the stations knew the show was popular, and so they would promo it, and we didn't have to do that. And then not too long after, we got word that some other healthcare systems around the state were looking at doing a similar thing. It just makes sense.
Yeah, you became a trendsetter. Yeah. So that, I'm assuming that obviously we thought this was a good idea, invested the time and the resources, but how cool was it that you were really right about that, that really was a good idea? That must have been very satisfying.
It was. It wasn't just my idea, though. There was full staff participation and discussion about our options here. And I think, like I say, there were some TV savvy people on the staff who had good relationships with the stations here and helped mold the proposal. And I really wasn't the one doing that. I have to give them credit for figuring out how to get the right kind of host and how to segment the thing. And so I could see that this was going to be better than the magazine medium that I had more experience with. But yeah, the staff was definitely right. The TV show did very well for us, and it's pretty nimble. So if there's some event that needs more discussion, we can have it on the air the next week.
And the show is a little bit symbolic of the trend that has sort of evolved over the course of your career of public relations folks being very focused on coordination with gatekeepers, the media, government officials, whoever has access to audiences, to being able to go direct to consumer with more controlled media. Websites, of course, really started that. obviously social media, and then also producing your own content. When your career first started, that was not what people did. Right? But now it obviously has become more popular, more effective, and again, a pretty big transition, not having that gatekeeper component.
Well, you're right. That has changed an awful lot, and that's a big question with a lot of parts to it. And there's probably no more important development in the public relations field than that. It's been huge. But I was fortunate in the very first PR job I had back way before I even went to law school. So 1970 something. I was asked to start a magazine that would go out to all the donors quarterly. And so I did all the writing and photography for it, even down to some photography in the operating room occasionally. And it was well received, and I had the opportunity to see what that could do, having a medium we controlled and that went out to a pretty big audience. So at that time, it was also common to have internal publications for employees. That had been common for a long while. So it didn't just start out of the blue exactly, but there were two things going on. One was, as you mentioned, the internet and the opportunity to create your own websites and go direct to the public. Any individual can do it, but certainly a large organization with resources can do it real well. So that was going on at the same time that the traditional news media were running into more and more trouble. They were losing their advertisers and gobbling one another up. And so the competitive, objective spirit of a lot of good newspapers was going away. And they were going back to where they are now in many cases with a pretty clear political affiliation. And so they're losing part of their audience as they do that. And their staffs have shrunk dramatically. So PR offices can't rely on traditional news media to get out even newsy things. And thus, with these developments going on at roughly the same time, good communications units these days have to figure that a big part of what they do is to run their own newsroom and educate the public on important things that they're experts on, and to write and research these things as good as any traditional medium would have. And so today in the healthcare field, Mayo Clinic is one of the leaders in this. They've been doing it for a while. And people have learned, if you're really curious about something your doctor told you and you want to research it more, you don't go to the New York Times, you go to the Mayo Clinic's site. Mm-hmm. And it's reliable, they're quick, and they explain their research well, and they've got people who are educated in science behind this thing as well as in journalism. And I think that is going to continue. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. And in fact, any larger public relations office that isn't doing something like this is probably missing the boat.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the trust factor with the Mayo Clinic. And, again, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? It really underscores something that has been a really important of public relations since the beginning, and that's the role of ethics, right? The role of making sure that practitioners communicating to their audiences are communicating factual, accurate information. And obviously that's very, very important, right? When you are going direct to consumer without a filter, and the consumers are, after engaging with your content, you're earning that trust. So that's kind of a fun, interesting note on that, right? Because now more than ever, perhaps ethics are central.
They are. And I think if you expect to get traction over the long term, you just have to play it straight with the facts. And sometimes that's not easy because the facts may be more complicated than you get in a 12-second segment on a TV news show. But that's okay. There's usually ways to explain things. And if it's played right down the middle, it's not done with some kind of political twist or sugarcoating or trying to overlook something to make the organization look better, then over the long term, there's going to be a great degree of trust there. And I know that some people will say, well, it's a PR operation. You're speaking on behalf of an organization. That can't be fully believable. But the traditional news media today are among the lowest trustworthy rated institutions in the country. So that's not making anything better. unfortunately. And so if a PR operation isn't going to do that and they're just going to twist the facts to always make it look like they're just fantastic, then over the long haul, they would have gained nothing.
And would not have earned that trust. So tell us about a couple of things that you're especially proud of throughout your career. I know we've kind of sprinkled a couple of them in, but anything else that stands out that, was something to be proud of?
Well, it's kind of tough to beat in the world of being a professor to see certain students just catch fire. They're not all going to, of course, but that's an exciting thing. And that was the case with you, for instance. I mean, your students graduate and they go off and take a big job in Sacramento or LA. And I feel like that's a victory for me, and it's an exciting thing. And similarly, at the community medical center's role that I ended up staying in for 20 years, I'm especially proud of where our staff got to. They're very talented at the things they do. They've made themselves a great transition into the internet world. They produce great content that the local medical community trusts and wants to be a part of. So I'm real proud, and much of that staff is still there and leading the unit now, including some other former students. And so that's probably the best thing.
I love it. So we've touched on the idea of technology, but let's kind of take a deeper dive. How has technology impacted your career?
Well, excellent question. And I suppose there are two sides to the answer that seem almost contradictory. But on the one hand, there are some developments in technology which I really love, and I think have allowed content creators to do better work. And it's as simple as things like email, which, no, I didn't have that when I started. So if I were typing a letter and I made a mistake, it was rip the paper out and start over. So I think some of those developments that we now take for granted have made it much easier to do excellent work and more work, and to be more efficient and to create better paper trails. And they have a lot of upsides, including the ease at which you can add graphics and so on to help with conveying a message. I would like to think that the staff I've had there for 2 decades at the healthcare system has made really good use of technology. But I would also say on the other side of the coin that in my particular role as the one who reported directly to the chief executive officer, he wasn't expecting technology from me. He was expecting good old-fashioned strategy, words on paper, and the ability to address the board of trustees. And in that respect, to be honest, not much has changed. So the things that were important 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago are still important in that regard at the highest levels of the practice. So the analogy I would use is when lawyers prepare briefs to go to the U.S. Supreme Court, they're still words on paper. They don't send them an email. They don't ask the Supreme Court to just go to their website or something. No. They deliver a brief that's a certain number of pages long that does not have a comma or an apostrophe out of place anywhere. It's been proofed and proofed again. The arguments are formed in the way to be as persuasive yet accurate as possible. And that's not something that's changed or is going to change next year because of some technology. And so similarly, if I'm preparing a proposal, whether it's a budget or a media campaign or something that I need the board of trustees to buy off on, it's the strength of my key arguments, why we would do this and why we're doing it at the cost that we're at. And I'm going to stand up in front of the trustees and make that argument. And I'm not going to rely on a PowerPoint presentation. Mm-hmm. Some might, but that would only be as a supplement and entirely unnecessary, to tell you the truth. So yeah, in that respect, I mean, the Gettysburg Address is still great. It doesn't matter that it wasn't on a website or a PowerPoint presentation at the time. Mm-hmm. So at the higher levels of the practice, it is kind of equatable to, say, the chief legal officer inside an organization. They use technology too, but in the meeting room when the big issues are discussed, there's no technology there.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. And the Gettysburg Address wasn't even typed, right? So,
and it was short.
There we go. Yes. Good advice. So speaking of public relations as an executive function, I think that's not something we talk about a great deal at the undergraduate level because we're typically most focused on the first couple of jobs in a student's career.
Which makes sense.
Which, thank you for validating that. But it's really important, though, to talk about public relations as an executive function as a really wonderful place for PR to make a really significant difference in an organization and is probably where it can shine the most. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit, as you have with my students on occasion, about how one would get there and what it takes to get there and stay there.
Well, I think that you're touching on a real predicament for a lot of folks because getting those entry-level kind of positions or maybe the first promotion is a relatively easy thing. And you might be an excellent graphic designer for websites or great at doing opinion research. And these are all obviously, there's a big list of important functions that have to be in a good office. But it's real easy to get stuck. And not everyone feels stuck because for some folks, that's exactly the job they want, of course. And there's nothing wrong with sticking in that job for a few decades. But for people who are more ambitious and want to have a bigger impact, then it comes down to what do you have to offer at the senior level of an organization that they can't easily get. So I had the good fortune of being able to demonstrate where senior administrations were missing some important things in their strategy or how they were being perceived, but also to offer the answer. And on multiple occasions, I did that, no charge, just friendly suggestion. But that's how you get the ball rolling, I think, which is at the heart of your question. If we work in a communications field, we're fortunate because it's relatively easy for us to demonstrate what we can do. Mm-hmm. I would guess that's a lot harder for, say, an accountant necessarily. I mean, there's ways to do it, but I can write one opinion piece and overnight I can get a lot of notice. Mm-hmm. So if you have very clear thought about how to present an argument or make a case, and you can execute that thought with really good writing, then you can impress people and move up because most folks will recognize that's something that they can't do or that they're having trouble with at a point in time. And that's why they might look to an outside agency to help them. But in a lot of fields these days, an outside agency is going to be grasping to fully understand a complex business. So I think the trick is to see what that business is going through, understand what it needs to do to have a smoother ride, and make sure you show what you can do to get them there. And my feeling is if you're willing to work hard enough to do that, there are very few organizations that are going to say, nah, we don't need that. We like the tough ride we're having now. They're not going to do that. So again, I would equate it to, say, chief counsel for an organization. There's a lot of lawyers that could be hired to write employment agreements. But how's the chief counsel different? The chief counsel understands the world of business or that organization's world of business and the predicaments they can get themselves into and is there in part to help them avoid it at the highest levels. That's a different job. And the PR person can do that. It's kind of funny little side anecdote, but back when I was writing the textbook, of course, I liked to have some illustrations in there. And for each one, I had to get permission, of course. So I wanted to run in the textbook an ad that had run in the New York Times, an ad that got them a lawsuit. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to have to get copyright clearance to run this ad. So I called the chief counsel's office inside the New York Times to get permission. And on the phone, the attorney said, oh, yeah, it's fine with me. I'll give you a copyright permission, but I'm not the one who makes the call. And I said, well, what do you mean you're not the one who makes the call? He said, no, you got to call the head of public relations. And so you see that there is a similarity in these tasks. And it was the PR person ultimately who was supposed to guard whether this was a good or bad call for the New York Times to have republished. And that's where the decision had to get made. But that means that there's a person that the New York Times trusts to make the right call on those things.
And did you get permission?
Yes.
I was hoping the story had a happy ending. Oh, good. So that's in the book. Excellent.
But yes, I think you're asking a really good question, and I've been asked it a lot over time, as you know, including in your class, where students will wonder, but how do I get from here to there? And it's not that dissimilar from some other fields where the question is, well, what are you capable of? And you have to show that first before you go asking for the job. It can't be, hey, but I'm sure I would be good at this. Well, you're in a field where you can show. And it's as easy as on the side, volunteering an op-ed piece to a newspaper. So you can show what you're capable of pretty easily in this field, I think.
And I really like the idea of the voluntary component right at the beginning, because if you are one that sees that you have an idea that could certainly solve a problem or at least mitigate a problem for your organization, and you're willing to share that idea and expertise, you are just so quickly adding value for yourself because you're proving that you are not one that has to stay in your bubble and you're not saying, oh, that's not in my job description, or any of those things that tend to stagnate careers, right? Quite frankly. And I think that's an interesting concept for several reasons. First of all, it makes perfect sense that is very effective. And then secondly, I think it encourages people to look for those things, right? And to be aware at the organizational level.
Yes. And these projects that someone might volunteer send up the ladder, so to speak, and say, I know I wasn't asked to do this, but I got this idea, and see what you think. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be some massive thing. In fact, in a smaller sense, it happens almost every day. So every time you send me a memo, I'm going to form an opinion. And I often encourage people to just spend more time thinking about how you write a persuasive memo that makes it clear why you're writing this, what the action is that you think is appropriate as a result. Do you have your supporting key facts? Is it not too long, not too short? It's an art form, but it can be a very powerful thing. So yes, there are all kinds of ways to show what you can do that don't have to be giant multi-week projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate that too, because I think perhaps someone might be intimidated by scope, right? And I appreciate that it doesn't have to be, a strategic plan. It can certainly be a small tweak to something and have real value.
It works this way throughout the communications and entertainment world. It's not a matter of how much time you put in. It's more like a baseball team, right? Mm-hmm. So if I can pitch it 92 miles an hour, I can pitch it 92 miles an hour, and most people can't. So similarly here, if you're a musician, your notoriety in the field, your contracts, your labels, everything go up if the product is really good. And so similarly for us in the communications field, let's take an example of a nonfiction book writer. How do you get a book contract? Mm-hmm. What do you have to do first? You have to write the first chapter. That's what you have to do. And you have to have a summary of the project and why it's important to that publisher. And then you submit it. And based on that, they may offer an advance and a contract. But you have to do that first. Mm-hmm. And you're not being paid to do that. But do you want the book contract or not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite a good analogy.
So the publisher gets these queries by the bushelful every day. And so they become experts at seeing the ones that are phrased the best in their summary and then executed the best in that sample chapter. So that's not too dissimilar from the opportunities for PR people, advertising people, marketing folks.
Mm-hmm. So what are the things that you have seen evolve throughout your career, things that you feel have been really positive for the industry? Things that weren't around, ideas, tactics, technology, take your pick, and now are that have really made this better?
I do think that the ability to get to audiences in a more pointed, meaningful way, segmented audiences, has been a huge development. And so we don't have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to reach the so-called general public through a newspaper, for example, when we might have at our fingertips a database of email addresses of people we already know are interested in this certain part of our business. So how important is that? It's huge. And that is a relatively recent thing. Maybe email's now an old thing, but managing really good email databases is still a developing thing. And that's an example of being able to get to people who are already predisposed to be very interested in this topic that you're sending out. So that's been a gigantic change. Heck, you can even go to a website and click on the avenue you want to follow and go straight in there. So that's pretty different from how a lot of the traditional media worked. And we used to have to spend all kinds of money to do so-called ad campaigns that blanketed a community, reaching maybe 8 out of 10 people who we knew weren't really in the market for our content. So we don't have to do that anymore. It's interesting, but in the 1980s, when the magazine industry was at its peak, magazines were considered to be the medium that were best at targeting audiences. And so you got these niche magazines, more and more and more. So there'd be a magazine just for runners, but then there'd be a magazine for trail runners, and it just kept going. And so the magazines didn't have huge circulations, but the advertisers in those magazines knew they were getting to people who were interested in what they had, nearly 100%. Unfortunately, magazines suffered with the rest of the print media because a better option emerged. But this idea of reaching an interested audience first really came from magazines, who became the experts at doing that.
And being able to segment in that way is good both for practitioners and consumers, right? Practitioners are able to get the information to folks who are more than likely interested, and then consumers receive information that they are more than likely interested in versus things that they're not. And so that's definitely a welcome change on both sides.
Right. And as the consumer, I can get more information quicker now in areas that I'm really interested in than ever before. It's really amazing. And up-to-date information. I think that another example of where that's obviously important is with emergency services of one kind or another. So it's important for the U.S. Forest Service and for Caltrans and for emergency response systems to have vibrant, up-to-date communications vehicles, so that if I'm seeing smoke on the highway up ahead, I can quickly figure out, hey, can I progress here or not? So it's great to have those tools, but you still have to staff them and be committed to using them to their potential, of course.
So for folks who are contemplating getting into this world, just starting their careers, what advice would you give?
Well, there's probably a long list, and instead of going down the whole list, I should probably just try and focus on a few things which I would look for first if I'm reading a resume or advising someone even just to pick this as a major. One thing is probably should get an A in English composition because you're going to be stuck with that for life. So it's good to figure out why some sentences are better than others. So we're diving in first here to what I would call just the mechanics of this. But if you don't have the mechanics of it, then you can dream to do all kinds of other things, but the lack of those good mechanics is going to hold you back. So it's kind of like having a vision to climb El Cap, but you really don't have down the technique for how to place your anchors. You're probably not going to get that far. So picking up writing skills and practicing them and challenging yourself, and there's all kinds of self-exams you can take out there and score yourself and see why it is you're missing 60% of the questions. That should be something that gets mastered fairly early on. And then I think from there, another important thing is to see all the elements of communication and how they fit together, and to develop an eye and an ear for all these things, because the person who sees that the best is probably looking at a future with fewer boundaries to it. And by that I mean, can you tell a good photograph from a bad one? Can you tell a piece of music that belongs with your organization's image or not? Can you tell if a particular proposal for a logo is one that your organization can run with or not, or that is just appealing or not, or memorable or not, or can you really not tell the difference? So these are all things that fit together. And if you really enjoy all those parts of communication, that's a good sign you're headed in the right direction. So you can't be, I would say, clunky at some of those pieces and expect that you're going to have a huge horizon. But it is amazing still today how often I will see a website or a printed piece where it probably went through many pairs of eyes, might have gone through an agency, and still there are terrible mistakes made in graphic design, like, white type over a yellow field that is impossible to read, and it happens still. So someone's eyes weren't good enough to spot this. And I think that if the question is, are you in the right field? How good are your eyes and ears at really appreciating good communication versus not so much?
So with the writing, obviously that may be a little quote unquote easier to acquire that skill set. I'm curious what your advice would be to acquire the secondary skill set, right? How would one get better at identifying, what a good photo is and what a good piece of music that matches an organization? Because that feels, of course, like an art and a science. Or maybe just an art. I don't know. But what would you advise folks if they really wanted to feel confident on that piece?
Well, even though I've said there are mechanics involved, so there are certain things that just are, and there are rules that go with it, and they are part of the territory. So if the sentence has 68 words in it, it's too long. It's not going to work. If you're trying to use a camera and your aperture is way too wide, you're going to get a fuzzy picture. Then you're just arguing with mechanics of how cameras work, and you're going to lose. However, having said that, my feeling is this whole field is at least 80% art, is my feeling. Mm-hmm. And so now if you want to follow up and say, okay, but then, why is it that one person's eye for art is better than another, whether it's musical art or painting or anything else? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but you can find out where things seem to come easier for you. Mm-hmm. So all these things are available to investigate. And the thing is, a lot of these things have been well investigated before a student enters college. I mean, we all have these phones now that are communication vehicles of every sort. How well do you enjoy using it? How well do you use it? If you put your work up for critique, how's it come back? And that should tell you something. But this applies to a lot of things in life, right? You investigate things, and when you see that something comes easier to you than to most folks, that's a clue. And if it comes harder, that's a clue too.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking a deep dive into that. So what else, if anything, would you like to add before we wrap up today?
Oh, I've enjoyed this chat a lot. I mean, these are important topics. And I guess what I'd like to just add is that these topics are so important that they, I think, go to the heart of how well our country is going to operate in the future in a competitive world. How well we're going to address environmental issues that are plaguing our entire planet, and how well we'll navigate rough political climate, not just domestically. I mean, there's a lot of bad things going on in the world right now that need solutions, and they're tough solutions. Communications people are going to play a critical role in solving these things. Good communications people, PR people, are needed on the staffs of public figures. They're needed in public agencies. They're needed in the media, in public discourse. We need good authors to take deep dives into things. We need people who can utilize the internet in a way that draws attention quickly to things that need the public to take a closer look at. And so my final thought on this is just that if this field in some way is for you, you can have a big impact with it and not just have a great career where you get to exercise your artistic vision to communicate better, but you can have an impact that really solves problems, including some big ones. And I'm a bit afraid of the future in the sense that it's harder and harder to tell what's true and what's not. And I think that's a problem that's going to get worse. And we have to have have a way to create trusted sources of information across all these different important realms, from education to healthcare and so on. So, yeah, it's fun to chat about good memos and ad campaigns and so on, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here, which is that these activities can be critically important to moving our state in the right direction, moving the globe in the right direction. So if you have these skills, you really should run with them, I think.
Mm-hmm. Very, very, very powerful. Yes, that's why we need to use them for good and not evil. As I tell my students all the time. Yes.
Please, that would be good.
Yes. Use them for good, not evil. Oh, goodness. Well, John, thank you so much for your time today, and just appreciate all of your wisdom and advice, and just very grateful.
Of course, it's always good to chat with you, and I still can't believe we've known each other that long. Seems like you just graduated.
Yes, I agree. It feels like that to me too. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Central Valley Stories, Advertising and Public Relations. Join us again next time as we talk history, trends, changes, and challenges with more of the region's veteran practitioners and agency owners. Until then, take care and be well.